In the sterile marble corridors of the Federal District Court, where power speaks in hushed tones and justice wears a blindfold, nobody could have predicted that a single afternoon would shatter decades of judicial tradition. What began as routine, proceedings in courtroom 7B would become the epicenter of a scandal so profound that it would force an entire system to confront its own reflection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Attorney Elena Martinez walked through those hallowed halls carrying more than just legal briefs. She carried the weight of truth, the burden of evidence, and most importantly, a secret that would transform her from target to hunter in the span of 60 devastating minutes. The woman they thought they could humiliate had been 3 steps ahead all along, documenting every whispered insult, every condescending smirk, every abuse of power hidden behind the sacred robes of judicial authority. This is the story of how one woman's quiet preparation brought down a corrupt system that had grown too comfortable in its arrogance, how a federal judge's mockery became her own undoing, how the very technology meant to ensure transparency was turned into a weapon of accountability by someone who understood that sometimes justice requires more than just legal arguments. The morning of October 15th arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the granite steps of the Theodore Brennan Federal Courthouse gleam like polished marble under the early sunlight. Elena Martinez adjusted the strap of her leather briefcase as she climbed those steps, each footfall echoing with the deliberate rhythm of someone who had walked this path many times before, but never with stakes quite this high. At 38, Elena had built her reputation on 2 unshakable foundations: meticulous preparation and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. Her colleagues at Morrison, Blake and Associates often joked that she could probably argue a case during an earthquake without spilling her coffee. What they didn't know, what nobody in the legal community suspected, was that Elena had spent the last 6 months preparing for something far more treacherous than any opposing counsel or hostile witness. She had been preparing for Judge Victoria. Stone, the briefcase in Elena's hand, contained more than the usual array of legal documents, precedent cases, and carefully tabbed evidence folders. Hidden within its quilted interior, disguised as nothing more than a standard legal recording device, sat a piece of technology that would change everything. The device was perfectly legal, completely within her rights as an attorney to possess, and absolutely devastating in its potential applications. Elena had purchased it 3 months ago, after the 3rd incident of judicial misconduct she had witnessed in Stone's courtroom. Incidents that had left her sleepless and questioning everything she thought she knew about the integrity of the federal bench. The security checkpoint inside the courthouse lobby operated with the same bureaucratic efficiency it had maintained for decades. Elena placed her briefcase on the conveyor belt, walked through the metal detector, and retrieved her belongings with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times. The security guard, a pleasant man named Robert, who had worked the morning shift for nearly 20 years, offered his usual greeting. "Morning, counselor. Big case today?" Eleanor smiled, the expression carrying just enough warmth to seem genuine while revealing nothing of the storm brewing. "Beneath the surface, they're all big cases, Robert. That's why they pay us the medium-sized money." It was the kind of light banter that filled courthouse hallways every morning, meaningless pleasantries that served as social lubricant in a building where the stakes were always life-altering for someone. But as Eleanor walked toward the bank, of elevators that would carry her to the 7th floor, her mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating variables and contingencies with the precision of a chess grandmaster. Judge Victoria Stone had been appointed to the federal bench 12 years ago, riding a wave of political connections and carefully cultivated relationships that had more to do with her ability to navigate power structures than her judicial temperament. At 55, she had developed a reputation among the legal community that existed in two distinct versions, depending on who was doing the talking. The public version, the one that appeared in legal journals and bar association newsletters, painted Stone as a no-nonsense jurist who ran her courtroom with efficiency and commanded respect from all parties. The private version, whispered in conference rooms and spoken in hushed tones over drinks at the lawyer hangouts near the courthouse, told a different story entirely. Stone was known to have favorites, to make decisions based on personal relationships rather than legal merit, and most troublingly, to treat certain attorneys with a level of contempt that bordered on judicial misconduct. Elena had been on the receiving end of Stone's particular brand of courtroom tyranny for the better part of 2 years. It had started small, as these things often do. A cutting remark about Elena's appearance during oral arguments, a dismissive wave of the hand when Elena attempted to present evidence, questions from the bench that seemed designed more to humiliate than to clarify legal points. Each incident, taken in isolation, could have been dismissed as the normal friction that sometimes occurs between strong personalities in high-pressure situations. But Elena had been keeping track. She had been documenting dates, times, witnesses, and the specific nature of each interaction. What had emerged from her careful record-keeping was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond the normal bounds of judicial authority and crossed firmly into the territory of personal vendetta. The elevator doors opened on the 7th floor with a soft chime that seemed to echo longer than usual in the marble-lined corridor. Elena stepped out into a hallway that had witnessed decades of legal history, where some of the most important cases in the district had been argued, where careers had been made and destroyed, where justice had been served and occasionally denied. Courtroom 7B sat at the end of the hall, its heavy oak doors bearing the weight of institutional authority. Elena paused for a moment before entering, not out of nervousness, but to center herself for what was about to unfold. She understood that the next few hours would either vindicate months of careful planning or destroy her career entirely. There was no middle ground, no compromise position. She was about to go to war with one of the most powerful figures in the federal judiciary, and she was going to do it with nothing but truth, preparation, and a recording device that most people would mistake for standard legal equipment. The courtroom itself was a masterpiece of federal architectural intimidation. High ceilings supported by marble columns created an atmosphere of reverence that was both inspiring and oppressive. The judge's bench, elevated above the rest of the room like an altar, commanded attention from every angle. Behind it, an American flag hung in perfectly arranged folds, a symbol of the justice system that Elena still believed in, despite everything she had witnessed. The gallery was already filling with the usual collection of court watchers, junior associates taking notes for senior partners, and law students who had been granted permission to observe federal proceedings. None of them had any idea they were about to witness something unprecedented in the history of the courthouse. Elena took her place at the defendant's table, arranging her materials with the same methodical precision she brought to every case. Her client, Marcus Thompson, a small business owner being prosecuted for alleged tax irregularities, sat beside her with the nervous energy of someone whose entire future hung in the balance. What Marcus didn't know, what Elena couldn't tell him, was that his case had become secondary to a much larger battle for the soul of judicial integrity. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen, occupied the plaintiff's table with the confident air of lawyers who believed they held every advantage. Chen was competent but unremarkable, the kind of prosecutor who won cases through preparation and institutional support rather than brilliance or innovation. He had worked with Judge Stone many times before and had never questioned her methods or motivations. That comfortable relationship was about to become a liability he couldn't imagine. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff's voice rang out across the courtroom with the traditional call that had opened federal proceedings for generations. All rise. The Honorable Judge Victoria Stone presiding. Court is now in session. The woman who emerged from the judge's chambers and took her place behind the bench bore little resemblance to the composed figure depicted in official photographs. Judge Stone was tall and angular, with silver hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the sharp lines of her face. Her black robes, which should have conveyed dignity and impartiality, instead seemed to amplify an aura of barely contained disdain for everyone in her courtroom. Stone's eyes swept across the assembled lawyers and spectators with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. When her attention settled on Elena, something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but a tightening around the eyes that suggested anticipation of the entertainment to come. "Good morning," Stone said, her voice carrying easily across the courtroom without any need for amplification. "We are here today for the continuation of United States versus Thompson. I trust all parties are prepared to proceed without delay." Elena rose from her chair with fluid grace, her movement drawing Stone's attention like a magnet. "Your Honor, the defense is prepared to proceed." "How refreshing," Stone replied, her tone already carrying the first hint of sarcasm that would become a torrent before the morning was over. "I do hope we can manage to get through today's proceedings without the theatrical flourishes that have characterized your previous appearances in my courtroom, Counselor." The comment landed in the silence of the courtroom, like a stone dropped into still water. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the inappropriate nature of the judge's remark, even if they couldn't quite believe they had heard it correctly. Elena, however, remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged, her posture radiating the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing exactly what game is being played. "Of course, Your Honor," Elena replied, her voice level and professional. "The defense will conduct itself with appropriate decorum." Stone's laugh was sharp and brief, like glass breaking. "Appropriate decorum. Yes, well, we shall see about that, won't we?" What Judge Stone didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have suspected as she settled into her chair with the satisfied air of someone preparing to enjoy a particularly entertaining afternoon, was that every word she had just spoken had been captured with crystal clarity by the device hidden in Elena's briefcase. Every inflection, every note of condescension, every hint of the personal animus that should have no place in a federal courtroom was now preserved for posterity. Elena opened her first file folder with deliberate care, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. She had spent months preparing for this moment, studying not just the law, but the psychology of power, the dynamics of institutional authority, and the precise methods by which corrupt officials reveal themselves when they believe they are operating without oversight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The case itself, the prosecution of Marcus Thompson for alleged tax evasion, was relatively straightforward. Thompson, a 43-year-old contractor, had been accused of underreporting income and claiming false deductions over a 3-year period. The evidence against him was circumstantial at best, consisting mainly of discrepancies between his reported income and his lifestyle that the prosecution argued could only be explained by hidden revenue streams. Elena had been building Thompson's defense for months, meticulously documenting every financial transaction, every business expense, every source of income that could account for the lifestyle that prosecutors found suspicious. But as she prepared to present that defense, she knew that the real battle would not be fought over tax codes and financial records. It would be fought over something much more fundamental, whether a federal judge could abuse her authority with impunity or whether someone would finally hold her accountable. "The prosecution may proceed with their opening statement," Stone announced, gesturing toward Chen with the casual authority of someone who had grown accustomed to absolute power within the confines of her domain. Chen rose and delivered a competent, if unspectacular, opening, outlining the government's case against Thompson in terms that were legally sound but lacking in the kind of passionate conviction that wins over juries. He spoke for 20 minutes, presenting evidence and promising testimony that would prove Thompson's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It was the kind of opening statement that law school professors would grade as adequate, meeting all technical requirements without inspiring anyone in the process. When Chen finished and returned to his seat, Stone turned her attention back to Elena with an expression that managed to convey both anticipation and contempt in equal measure. "Ms. Martinez, you may proceed with your opening statement. I do hope it will be more substantive than your previous efforts in my courtroom." The comment was so blatantly inappropriate that several people in the gallery audibly gasped. A judge criticizing an attorney's past performance during current proceedings violated every principle of judicial neutrality and due process. Elena, however, showed no reaction beyond a slight tightening of her grip on the file folder in her hands. "Thank you, Your Honor," Elena said, rising from her chair with the fluid grace of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense will show that Mr. Thompson is not a tax evader, but rather the victim of a prosecution that has confused suspicion with evidence and assumption with proof." Elena's opening statement was masterful, weaving together complex financial evidence and legal precedent into a narrative that was both compelling and easy to follow. She spoke for 35 minutes, presenting her client's case with the kind of passion and precision that had made her reputation as one of the most effective defense attorneys in the district. But throughout her presentation, Judge Stone's behavior grew increasingly hostile. She interrupted Elena's statement 6 times, with questions that served no legitimate judicial purpose, each interruption more aggressive than the last. She rolled her eyes visibly when Elena cited legal precedents that supported the defense position. She checked her watch repeatedly and made show of her impatience with theatrical sighs and finger-tapping on the bench. "Are you quite finished, Counselor?" Stone asked when Elena paused to reference a case citation. "Because I'm sure the jury is as eager as I am to move beyond these amateur dramatics and get to the actual evidence." Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried her through similar moments over the past 2 years. But this time, it was tempered by something else. The certain knowledge that every word of Stone's misconduct was being recorded with perfect clarity. The device in her briefcase was capturing not just the words, but the tone, the timing, the complete context of judicial behavior that crossed every line of professional ethics. "I apologize if my presentation is not meeting Your Honor's expectations," Elena replied, her voice carrying just enough deference to avoid a contempt citation while maintaining her dignity. "I will endeavor to be more concise." "See that you do," Stone snapped. "This court has better things to do than indulge your apparent need for attention." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a fire that everyone could see, but no one seemed able to extinguish. In the jury box, 12 citizens who had been selected precisely for their ability to remain impartial watched in growing discomfort as the person charged with ensuring fairness revealed herself to be anything but fair. Elena concluded her opening statement with professional grace, thanking the jury for their attention and promising to present evidence that would vindicate her client completely. As she returned to her seat, she caught the eye of Marcus Thompson, who looked both confused and terrified by the hostility he was witnessing from the bench. "Don't worry," Elena whispered to her client as she settled back into her chair. "Everything is going according to plan." It was a strange thing to say, given the obvious animosity being displayed by the judge, but Thompson found something reassuring in his attorney's calm confidence. What he couldn't know was that Elena's plan had never been to avoid Stone's hostility, but rather to document it so thoroughly that denial would become impossible. The morning proceeded with witness testimony that revealed both the strength of Elena's preparation and the depth of Stone's bias. When prosecution witnesses took the stand, Stone was attentive and encouraging, asking clarifying questions that helped strengthen the government's case and nodding approvingly at answers that supported the charges against Thompson. But when Elena cross-examined those same witnesses, Stone's demeanor changed completely. She sustained objections that had no legal basis, cutting off lines of questioning that were clearly relevant to the defense. She allowed prosecutors to ask leading questions while preventing Elena from using the same techniques. Most egregiously, she made faces at the jury when Elena was speaking, rolling her eyes and shaking her head in a clear attempt to undermine the defense attorney's credibility. By the lunch recess, Elena had documented more instances of judicial misconduct than she had witnessed in her previous 2 years of appearing before Stone combined. The judge was either having an exceptionally bad day, or she had grown so comfortable in her abuse of authority that she no longer bothered to conceal it even during high-profile proceedings. As the courtroom emptied for lunch, Elena remained at the defense table, ostensibly reviewing notes for the afternoon session. In reality, she was checking the recording device to ensure that everything was being captured properly. The technology was working flawlessly, storing every moment of the morning's proceedings in digital format that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Marcus Thompson approached her table during the recess, his face creased with worry and confusion. "Ms. Martinez, I have to ask, is the judge always like this? Because it seems like she's already decided I'm guilty." Elena looked up at her client, this decent man whose life had become collateral damage in a much larger war over judicial integrity. She wanted to tell him everything, to explain that his case had become the vehicle for exposing corruption that went far beyond tax evasion charges, but she couldn't reveal her strategy without compromising it. "Mr. Thompson," she said carefully, "I need you to trust me for a few more hours. I know this is difficult, but I promise you that everything happening in that courtroom is being handled exactly as it should be." Thompson didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded and walked away to find lunch, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and her recording device. She understood that the afternoon session would be even more crucial than the morning. Stone's behavior was escalating, and Elena needed to capture the moment when the judge's mask finally slipped completely. As courthouse staff and visitors streamed past the open courtroom doors on their way to lunch, none of them could have imagined that they were witnessing the calm before a storm that would reshape how judicial accountability was understood and enforced. The afternoon session of United States versus Thompson was about to become something unprecedented in federal court history. Elena spent the lunch hour not eating, but preparing for the most important cross-examination of her career. Not the cross-examination of prosecution witnesses, which was proceeding normally despite Stone's interference, but the cross-examination of the judicial system itself. She was about to put a federal judge on trial without the judge knowing it, using nothing but the truth and the technology to preserve it. At precisely 1:30, court reconvened with the same ceremonial formality that had opened the morning session. Judge Stone returned to the bench with renewed energy, as if the break had refreshed her appetite for the psychological warfare she had been waging against Elena all day. "The afternoon session is now in order," Stone announced. "I trust the defense is prepared to proceed with witnesses who will actually contribute something meaningful to these proceedings." Elena rose from her chair, straightening her jacket with the deliberate movement of someone preparing for battle. "Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Patricia Williams to the stand." Dr. Williams was Elena's expert witness, a certified public accountant with 30 years of experience in forensic accounting and small business taxation. She had spent weeks reviewing Marcus Thompson's financial records and was prepared to testify that his reported income was entirely consistent with his lifestyle and business expenses. As Dr. Williams took the oath and settled into the witness chair, Elena could feel the familiar electricity of a crucial moment approaching. This testimony would be the heart of Thompson's defense, the expert analysis that would either vindicate him or confirm the prosecution's suspicions. But more importantly, for Elena's larger purpose, it would provide the opportunity for Stone to reveal the full extent of her prejudice. Elena began her direct examination with the methodical precision that had made her reputation, walking Dr. Williams through her credentials, her methodology, and her conclusions about Thompson's financial situation. The testimony was technical but compelling, building a clear picture of a small business owner whose financial records, while not perfect, showed no evidence of the systematic fraud alleged by the prosecution. For the first 20 minutes of Dr. Williams' testimony, Stone remained relatively restrained, limiting herself to the occasional eye roll or impatient gesture. But as the expert's analysis began to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece, the judge's hostility became impossible to contain. "Objection!" Stone suddenly announced, interrupting Elena's question about depreciation schedules. "This testimony is becoming repetitive and irrelevant." Elena turned toward the bench with carefully controlled surprise. "Your Honor, the defense was not aware that the court was making objections on behalf of the prosecution." The comment was perfectly professional, technically accurate, and utterly devastating. Under normal circumstances, a judge making objections for the opposing party would be grounds for immediate appeal and possible judicial misconduct charges. In the context of everything that had happened during the day's proceedings, it was the equivalent of judicial suicide. Stone's face flushed red with anger, but she could not withdraw an objection she had made in front of a jury and a gallery full of witnesses. "The objection stands," she said through gritted teeth. "Move on to something relevant." Elena continued her examination, but Stone's interruptions became more frequent and more inappropriate. She cut off answers that favored the defense, allowed prosecution objections that had no legal basis, and made comments to the jury that clearly indicated her personal opinion about the case. The most egregious moment came when Dr. Williams was explaining how Thompson's business model, which involved significant seasonal variation in income, could account for the discrepancies that prosecutors found suspicious. As the expert provided detailed analysis that strongly supported the defense case, Stone suddenly stood up behind the bench. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she announced, "I think we've heard enough creative accounting for one day. Let's move on to something that might actually help us determine the truth." The statement was so blatantly prejudicial that even the prosecutors looked uncomfortable. Elena felt her heart racing, not with fear, but with vindication. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the complete abandonment of judicial neutrality that would make Stone's behavior impossible to defend or deny. "Your Honor," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtroom, "I believe the court may wish to reconsider that statement." Stone whirled around to face Elena, her composure finally shattered by months of frustration and the growing realization that her authority was being challenged in front of witnesses. "Are you instructing this court on how to conduct proceedings?" "Un counselor?" "Not at all, Your Honor," Elena replied with the calm precision of someone who had planned for exactly this moment. "I'm simply noting for the record that the court's commentary on the evidence may be inappropriate for jury consideration." It was a masterpiece of legal understatement, delivered with such professional courtesy that its impact was multiplied rather than diminished. Elena had just accused a federal judge of judicial misconduct, using language so polite that Stone could not respond with the fury the accusation deserved without proving its accuracy. The silence that followed stretched across the courtroom like a physical presence. In the jury box, 12 citizens stared at their hands, at the ceiling, at anything except the bench where a federal judge was clearly struggling to maintain control of both her courtroom and herself. Stone's response, when it finally came, exceeded even Elena's expectations for judicial impropriety. "Ms. Martinez," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage, "your consistent attempts to grandstand in my courtroom have been noted and will be addressed. I suggest you focus on practicing law rather than trying to practice judicial philosophy." Elena nodded politely, as if receiving helpful guidance rather than a personal attack from the bench. "Of course, Your Honor. Will that be reflected in the court record as part of today's proceedings?" The question was innocent in its phrasing, but devastating in its implications. Elena was asking, in front of a jury and a gallery full of witnesses, whether Stone wanted her inappropriate comments to become part of the official transcript that could be reviewed by appellate courts and judicial oversight committees. Stone realized too late that she had walked into a trap entirely of her own making. Every inappropriate comment, every biased ruling, every violation of judicial ethics had been witnessed by dozens of people and would be preserved in the court record forever. But what she still didn't understand was that Elena had been recording everything with a clarity and completeness that would make denial impossible. The afternoon session continued for another hour, with Stone's behavior becoming increasingly erratic as she realized that her authority was being challenged in ways she had never experienced. Elena conducted the rest of her case with flawless professionalism, presenting evidence and examining witnesses with the kind of skill that had built her reputation as one of the finest attorneys in the district. But the real drama was taking place at the judicial bench, where a federal judge was slowly destroying her own career with behavior that would have been inappropriate in traffic court, let alone federal criminal proceedings. Stone continued to make biased rulings, inappropriate comments, and personal attacks on Elena that violated every principle of judicial conduct. As the day drew to a close, Elena prepared for the moment that would transform everything. She had captured enough evidence of judicial misconduct to end Stone's career, but she needed to reveal that evidence in a way that would maximize its impact and minimize the opportunity for damage control or cover-up. "Your Honor," Elena said, as Stone prepared to adjourn for the day, "before we conclude, I have a matter that requires the court's immediate attention." Stone looked down at Elena with barely concealed hostility. "What now, Counselor?" Elena reached into her briefcase and withdrew the recording device, placing it on the defense table where everyone in the courtroom could see it clearly. "Your Honor, I need to inform the court that today's proceedings have been recorded in their entirety, as is my right under federal law governing attorney work product and court transcription." The color drained from Stone's face as the implications of Elena's statement began to sink in. "What exactly are you saying, Ms. Martinez?" Elena's response was delivered with the kind of calm precision that comes from months of preparation and absolute certainty about the righteousness of one's cause. I'm saying, Your Honor, that every inappropriate comment, every biased ruling, and every violation of judicial ethics that occurred in this courtroom today has been preserved with perfect clarity. And I'm saying that this recording will be submitted to the appropriate authorities for review. The silence that followed was unlike anything that had ever been heard in a federal courtroom. It was the silence of a system confronting its own. Corruption, the silence of power being held accountable by truth, the silence of justice finally finding its voice. Judge Victoria Stone sat behind her bench, staring at the recording device that had captured her own destruction, realizing too late that the attorney she had tried to humiliate had been 3 steps ahead all along. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was nowhere left to hide. The courthouse clock tower chimed 5:30 as Elena Martinez walked through the marble corridors with the measured pace of someone whose world had just shifted on its axis. The recording device, nestled securely in her briefcase, felt heavier now, weighted not by its physical mass but by the magnitude of what it contained. Behind her, courtroom 7B had emptied with unusual haste, as if the spectators and court personnel instinctively understood they had witnessed something that would reverberate far beyond the confines of a single afternoon. Judge Victoria Stone had adjourned court immediately after Elena's revelation, her gavel striking the bench with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot through the stunned silence. No scheduling of the next session, no standard procedural announcements, just a terse dismissal that left everyone wondering what would happen next. Stone had retreated to her chambers without another word, her black robes billowing behind her like the wings of a wounded predator seeking shelter. Elena's footsteps echoed in the emptying hallway as courthouse staff hurried past, their conversations hushed and urgent. Word was already spreading through the building's interconnected network of clerks, bailiffs, and administrative personnel. A federal judge had been caught on recording violating judicial ethics in the most blatant manner imaginable, and the attorney she had tried to destroy possessed irrefutable evidence of every transgression. The elevator ride to the lobby felt longer than usual, each floor marking another step away from the battlefield where Elena had just fired the opening shot in a war that would consume the federal judicial system. She had spent months preparing for this moment, but the reality of what she had set in motion was beginning to settle in her chest like a stone. There would be no going back now, no quiet resolution behind closed doors. She had declared war on judicial corruption at the highest levels, and the consequences would ripple through every courthouse in the district. Marcus Thompson caught up with her just as the elevator doors opened on the main floor. Her client's face bore the confused expression of someone who had watched his attorney perform legal alchemy, transforming what appeared to be certain defeat into something that looked suspiciously like victory. "Ms. Martinez," Thompson said, his voice carrying the tremor of someone still processing what he had witnessed. "I don't understand what just happened in there. Are you telling me you've been recording the judge this whole time?" Elena turned to face her client as they walked toward the courthouse exit, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes betraying the exhaustion of someone who had just fought the most important battle of her career. "Mr. Thompson, I recorded today's proceedings using equipment that is completely legal and within my rights as your attorney. Everything that happened in that courtroom today was captured exactly as it occurred." Thompson nodded slowly, though his confusion remained evident. "But why? I mean, I could see the judge was being unfair, but recording her? That seems like something that could get you in serious trouble." Elena paused at the top of the courthouse steps, looking back at the imposing granite facade that housed a system she still believed in, despite everything she had witnessed. "Mr. Thompson, Sometimes the only way to protect justice is to document injustice. Judge Stone has been abusing her authority for years, targeting certain attorneys and defendants while showing favoritism to others. What happened to you today wasn't personal. You were just the latest victim of a pattern of corruption that had to be exposed. Though, the autumn air carried a chill that seemed to penetrate Elena's professional composure as she descended the courthouse steps. Behind them, lights were beginning to flicker on in windows throughout the building as evening settled over the federal complex. Somewhere in those illuminated offices, phones were ringing, emails were being composed, and conversations were taking place that would determine how the legal establishment would respond to the crisis Elena had just created. Thompson walked beside her in thoughtful silence until they reached the sidewalk where the courthouse plaza met the busy downtown street. Traffic hummed past in the gathering dusk, ordinary people heading home from ordinary jobs, unaware that the foundations of judicial authority had just been shaken by a woman with a briefcase and an unwavering commitment to truth. "What happens now?" Thompson asked as Elena hailed a taxi. Elena's response came without hesitation, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had planned for every contingency. "Now, we wait for the system to prove whether it's capable of policing itself or whether it will try to destroy the messenger instead of addressing the message." As Thompson disappeared into the crowd of evening commuters, Elena stood alone on the courthouse steps, her briefcase clutched tightly in her hand. The recording device inside contained more than just evidence of judicial misconduct. It contained the seeds of institutional change, the proof that would force an entire system to confront its own capacity for corruption. But Elena understood that possessing the truth and seeing justice done were two entirely different challenges. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from David Morrison, the senior partner at her law firm. Elena had been expecting this conversation since the moment she revealed the recording in open court. Morrison had built his reputation on discretion and institutional relationships, and Elena's nuclear option approach to judicial accountability would test every diplomatic skill he had developed over 3 decades of practice. Elena, Morrison's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying to manage a crisis while gathering information. "I've been getting calls about what happened in Stone's courtroom today. Do you want to tell me your version before I hear it from everyone else in the legal community?" "Aye, soon." Elena found a quiet corner of the plaza where she could speak without being overheard by the stream of people exiting the courthouse. "David, I recorded Judge Stone violating judicial ethics repeatedly and blatantly during today's proceedings. The recording is clear, comprehensive, and undeniable. I'm prepared to submit it to the appropriate oversight authorities." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Elena to count her own heartbeats. When Morrison finally responded, his voice carried the weight of someone calculating the cost of various courses of action. "Elena, you understand what you're proposing to do? You're talking about destroying a federal judge's career based on one day's proceedings. That's not a decision that can be unmade." "I'm talking about documenting judicial misconduct that has been ongoing for years," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the conversation. "Judge Stone has been abusing her authority systematically, and today's recording is just the most recent evidence of a pattern that demands accountability." Morrison's next question revealed the practical considerations that would dominate the firm's response to Elena's revelation. "Who else knows about this recording? Has anyone heard it besides you?" "No one has heard the recording yet, but approximately 50 people witnessed the behavior it documents. The court reporter has a transcript of everything that was said on the record, and the inappropriate comments were made in open court, with a full gallery of observers." Elena could hear Morrison's breathing change as he processed the implications of her answer. A recording that only she had heard could potentially be dismissed or discredited. Judicial misconduct witnessed by dozens of people in open court was an entirely different challenge for damage control. Elena, I need you to come to the office immediately. Don't go home, don't stop anywhere, and don't talk to anyone else about this situation. We need to discuss how to handle this properly. The urgency in Morrison's voice confirmed what Elena had already suspected. Her revelation had set in motion a chain of events that would quickly spiral beyond anyone's ability to control. The legal establishment would mobilize quickly to minimize damage to institutional credibility, and Elena's role in that process would depend entirely on how effectively she could maintain control of the narrative. The law firm of Morrison, Blake and Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that overlooked the courthouse district. Elena had spent countless hours in those offices over the past 5 years, building cases, preparing arguments, and developing the expertise that had made her one of the firm's most valuable assets. But as she entered the lobby that evening, she felt like a stranger returning to a place that no longer quite fit her. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor gave Elena time to consider the conversation that awaited her. Morrison was a skilled attorney and an even more skilled politician, someone who had navigated the treacherous waters of legal practice by building relationships and avoiding unnecessary conflicts. Elena's nuclear approach to judicial accountability represented everything Morrison had spent his career trying to avoid. The firm's conference room commanded a panoramic view of the city skyline, with the courthouse complex visible in the distance like a cluster of monuments to institutional authority. Morrison was already waiting when Elena arrived, along with 2 other senior partners whose presence confirmed the gravity of the situation. Margaret Blake, the firm's managing partner, sat at the head of the conference table with the composed expression of someone preparing to make difficult decisions. Robert Chen, the firm's litigation department head, reviewed documents with the focused intensity of someone searching for legal precedents that might apply to an unprecedented situation. Morrison gestured for Elena to take a seat across from the assembled partners, the configuration suggesting a formal interview rather than a collegial discussion. Elena, we've been discussing the situation you've created, and we need to understand exactly what you're proposing to do with this recording. Elena placed her briefcase on the conference table, but made no move to open it. The recording device inside remained her most powerful asset and her greatest vulnerability, the evidence that could either vindicate her actions or destroy her career, depending on how the legal establishment chose to respond. I'm proposing to submit the recording to the Judicial Conduct Board along with a formal complaint documenting Judge Stone's pattern of misconduct. The evidence is clear and compelling, and the board has a responsibility to investigate judicial ethics violations. Margaret Blake leaned forward slightly, her expression carrying the calculated concern of someone who had spent decades managing institutional relationships. Elena, you understand that what you're proposing could end Victoria Stone's career. A federal judge doesn't recover from the kind of scandal you're describing. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? The question struck at the heart of Elena's motivation, the moral calculation that had driven her to risk everything for the sake of judicial accountability. Margaret, Judge Stone has been ending attorneys' careers for years through biased rulings and personal vendettas. She's denied due process to countless defendants and undermined public confidence in the judicial system. The responsibility for her destruction lies with her actions, not with my documentation of them. Robert Chen looked up from his legal research with the sharp focus of someone who had identified a crucial issue. Elena, the legal ramifications of this situation extend far beyond Judge Stone's career. If you proceed with this complaint, Every case she's presided over for the past several years could be subject to appeal. We're talking about potentially thousands of cases, millions of dollars in litigation costs, and a constitutional crisis that could take decades to resolve. Elena had anticipated this argument, the institutional concern that would prioritize systemic stability over individual justice. Robert, the alternative is allowing judicial corruption to continue unchecked, because addressing it would be inconvenient. That's not a legal system worth preserving. Morrison's response revealed the firm's primary concern about Elena's revelation. Elena, we need to discuss how this situation affects your position with the firm. Your actions today have created a crisis that will impact every relationship we've built with the federal judiciary. Judges will question our firm's loyalty and discretion, prosecutors will hesitate to offer plea agreements, and our clients will suffer the consequences. The threat was delivered with professional courtesy, but its implications were unmistakable. Elena's commitment to judicial accountability had made her a liability to the firm's business interests, and her partners were prepared to sacrifice her career to protect their institutional relationships. David, I understand the firm's concerns about maintaining judicial relationships, but I would argue that our reputation should be built on legal excellence and ethical integrity, not on tolerating judicial misconduct in exchange for favorable treatment. Blake's expression hardened as Elena's response made clear that she would not be easily persuaded to abandon her course of action. Elena, what you call ethical integrity, others might characterize as career suicide disguised as moral grandstanding. You've placed this firm in an impossible position, and we need to discuss how to minimize the damage. Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried her through the afternoon's courtroom confrontation, but this time it was tempered by the realization that she was fighting a battle on multiple fronts simultaneously. The recording device in her briefcase contained evidence that could transform the judicial system, but only if she could survive the institutional backlash long enough to see that evidence properly evaluated. Margaret, I appreciate the firm's position, but I'm not prepared to suppress evidence of judicial misconduct to protect business relationships. If that makes me unemployable within the current system, then perhaps the system needs to change. The conference room fell silent as Elena's declaration settled over the assembled partners like a challenge that could not be ignored or deflected. She had just announced her willingness to sacrifice her career for the sake of principle, transforming a business discussion into a moral confrontation that would force everyone present to choose sides. Morrison's response came after a long pause, delivered with the careful precision of someone making a decision that would have lasting consequences. Elena, the firm cannot support your decision to pursue this complaint against Judge Stone. If you proceed with submitting that recording to the oversight authorities, you'll be doing so as a private citizen, not as a representative of Morrison, Blake and Associates. Elena nodded slowly, understanding that she had just been formally abandoned by the institution that had shaped her career for the past 5 years. The firm's decision was predictable and probably unavoidable, but it still carried the sting of betrayal from people she had considered allies in the pursuit of justice. I understand the firm's position, Elena replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting. I'll submit my resignation effective immediately and proceed with the complaint as a private citizen. Blake's expression softened slightly, revealing something that might have been admiration beneath the professional concern. Elena, you don't have to resign immediately. Take some time to consider the implications of what you're proposing. This isn't a decision that can be reversed once you've committed to it. Elena stood from her chair, gathering her briefcase with the deliberate movement of someone who had made an irrevocable choice. "Margaret, I've been considering this decision for months. Judge Stone's behavior has crossed every line of judicial impropriety, and someone has to hold her accountable. If that someone has to be me acting alone, then that's what I'm prepared to do." As Elena walked toward the conference room door, Morrison made one final attempt to dissuade her from a course of action that would isolate her from every institutional support system in the legal community. "Elena, think about what you're giving up. Your career, your reputation, your financial security, all for a principle that most people won't understand or appreciate." Elena paused at the door, looking back at the three partners who had just severed their professional relationship with her. "David, I'm not giving up anything. I'm choosing what matters most, and what matters most is ensuring that federal judges can't abuse their authority without consequences." The elevator ride to the lobby felt different than her arrival an hour earlier. Elena was no longer an associate at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. She was an unemployed attorney with a recording device and a mission that would consume everything she had worked to build over the past decade. But as the elevator descended through 42 floors of corporate legal practice, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months of planning and preparation: absolute clarity about her purpose. The lobby of the Morrison building was nearly empty as evening settled over the downtown district. Elena's footsteps echoed on marble floors that had seemed welcoming when she arrived, but now felt cold and institutional. Behind her, the law firm continued its evening routine of billing hours and building relationships, the machinery of legal practice grinding forward without pause for moral considerations. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Thompson asking about the status of his case. The simple question reminded her that her war against judicial corruption had begun with a commitment to defend one innocent man against prosecutorial overreach and judicial bias. Whatever happened next, she could not lose sight of that fundamental obligation. Standing on the sidewalk outside the Morrison building, Elena looked back at the tower that had housed her professional life for 5 years. Somewhere on the 42nd floor, 3 partners were probably discussing damage control strategies and client retention plans. They would survive her departure and rebuild whatever relationships her actions had damaged, but they would never, again, be able to claim ignorance about the corruption that infected the judicial system they served. Elena's apartment was a 20-minute walk through downtown streets that were beginning to empty as the business day concluded. The recording device in her briefcase seemed to pulse with energy as she walked, its contents representing months of careful planning finally coming to fruition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new battles, but tonight, Elena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at having finally acted on convictions that had been building for years. Her apartment building stood in a quiet residential neighborhood that offered refuge from the intensity of courthouse politics and law firm pressures. Elena had chosen the location specifically for its distance from the legal district, wanting a home that felt separate from the professional conflicts that dominated her working hours. But tonight, the separation felt artificial. Her personal life and professional mission had merged into a single purpose that would reshape both in ways she was only beginning to understand. Elena's apartment reflected the austere discipline that had characterized her approach to legal practice: minimal furniture, carefully organized law books, and a single photograph of her law school graduation ceremony. The recording device sat on her kitchen table like an artifact from another world, its black plastic surface offering no hint of the explosive contents it contained. For the first time since revealing the recording in open court, Elena allowed herself to consider the full magnitude of what she had set in motion, Judge Victoria Stone would almost certainly be removed from the bench, her career destroyed by evidence of misconduct that no investigation could ignore or explain away. The ramifications would extend far beyond Stone's personal destruction, forcing a reckoning with judicial accountability that the legal establishment had avoided for decades. Elena's laptop computer sat open on her kitchen table beside the recording device, its screen displaying the website for the Federal Judicial Conduct Board. The complaint form was straightforward, requesting basic information about the nature of the misconduct and the evidence supporting the allegations. But Elena understood that submitting the form would trigger an investigation process that would consume months or years of her life. Her phone rang at 8:30, displaying the number for the courthouse clerk's office. Elena hesitated before answering, uncertain what communication from court personnel might mean at this late hour. The voice that greeted her belonged to Elena Martinez, the chief clerk for the Federal District Court, someone Elena had worked with on hundreds of cases over the past 5 years. "Ms. Martinez, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to let you know that Judge Stone has requested an emergency hearing tomorrow morning regarding today's proceedings. You're expected to appear at 9 o'clock to address the recording you mentioned in court." Elena felt her pulse quicken as she processed the implications of Sarah's call. Stone was moving quickly to contain the damage from Elena's revelation, probably hoping to suppress the recording before it could be submitted to oversight authorities. "Sarah, did Judge Stone indicate what specific issues she wants to address at this hearing?" "The order doesn't specify, but it references contempt of court and possible sanctions for unauthorized recording of judicial proceedings. Ms. Martinez, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but Judge Stone seemed very upset when she issued the order. You might want to consider bringing support with you tomorrow." Elena thanked Sarah for the warning and ended the call, understanding that tomorrow's hearing would be Judge Stone's attempt to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond her ability to manage. Stone would probably argue that Elena's recording violated court rules or attorney ethics, hoping to discredit the evidence before its contents could be evaluated by oversight authorities. But Elena had anticipated this response, and she was prepared for Stone's counterattack. The recording device sitting on her kitchen table contained more than just evidence of judicial misconduct. It contained the documentation of Stone's attempt to suppress that evidence, a pattern of behavior that would only strengthen the case for judicial accountability. Elena spent the evening transcribing key portions of the recording, creating a written record that would supplement the audio evidence in her complaint to the Judicial Conduct Board. Each inappropriate comment, each biased ruling, each violation of judicial ethics was documented with precise timestamps and contextual details that would make Stone's behavior impossible to deny or explain away. As midnight approached, Elena's preparation for tomorrow's confrontation was complete. She had copies of the recording stored in multiple locations, legal precedents supporting her right to document court proceedings, and a complaint ready for submission to the oversight authorities. Regardless of what happened in Stone's courtroom, Judge Victoria Stone had spent the day destroying her own career. But tomorrow, she would attempt to destroy Elena's reputation as a final act of judicial vengeance. Elena turned off her laptop and placed the recording device in her briefcase, understanding that tomorrow would bring the final confrontation in a battle that had begun months ago with her decision to document judicial corruption. Stone's emergency hearing was a trap designed to silence the evidence of her misconduct. But Elena was prepared to spring a trap of her own that would complete the judge's professional destruction. The apartment fell silent, except for the distant, hum of traffic, and the ticking of a kitchen clock marking the hours until tomorrow's hearing. Elena's career, as she had known it, was over, sacrificed on the altar of judicial accountability. But her mission was just beginning, and Judge Victoria Stone was about to discover that destroying the messenger would not eliminate the message that justice demands consequences for those who abuse their authority. The morning of October 16th arrived with a grey sky that seemed to mirror the tension radiating from the federal courthouse. Elena Martinez stood before her bathroom mirror, adjusting her navy blue suit jacket with the same methodical precision she brought to legal arguments. Today's hearing would be different from yesterday's proceedings. Judge Victoria Stone was no longer operating from a position of unquestioned authority, and Elena was no longer the isolated attorney fighting against institutional indifference. The recording device sat on Elena's kitchen counter beside a cup of untouched coffee, its presence a constant reminder of the evidence that had already begun reshaping the landscape of federal judicial accountability. Overnight, word of yesterday's courthouse drama had spread through legal circles with the velocity of wildfire, carried by clerks, bailiffs, and court reporters who understood they had witnessed something unprecedented in the annals of federal jurisprudence. Elena's phone had been ringing since 6 o'clock in the morning, with calls from reporters, fellow attorneys, and legal scholars who had heard fragments of the story and wanted confirmation of details that seemed too explosive to be true. She had declined all interviews, understanding that her words would be scrutinized and potentially used against her in the proceedings that lay ahead. The recording would speak for itself, but only if Elena could survive Stone's attempt to discredit both the evidence and the attorney who had gathered it. The walk to the courthouse felt different than yesterday's journey. Pedestrians on the street seemed to recognize Elena, their glances carrying the weight of curiosity about someone who had suddenly become the center of a legal scandal that was already making national headlines. The granite steps of the federal building seemed steeper, each footfall echoing with the gravity of a confrontation that would determine whether judicial accountability was possible within the existing system. Security procedures at the courthouse entrance carried an added dimension of scrutiny. Elena's briefcase was examined more thoroughly than usual, though the guards found nothing beyond standard legal materials and the recording device that was no longer a secret weapon but a documented piece of evidence in a case that had already consumed the attention of the Federal Judicial Administration. The 7th floor hallway buzzed with unusual activity as Eleanor emerged from the elevator. Court reporters, administrative staff, and legal observers clustered in small groups, their conversations stopping abruptly when Eleanor appeared. The atmosphere carried the electric tension of a community grappling with the revelation that one of its most powerful members had been systematically violating the ethical foundations of judicial authority. Courtroom 7B had been transformed overnight into something resembling a tribunal. Additional seating had been arranged to accommodate the unusual number of observers who had requested permission to attend the hearing. Representatives from the Judicial Conduct Board sat in the front row, their presence confirming that Elena's complaint had already triggered official oversight procedures that Stone could not control or suppress. Elena took her position at the defense table with the calm composure of someone who had anticipated every aspect of the morning's proceedings. Her briefcase contained multiple copies of the recording, transcripts of the most egregious violations, and legal precedents supporting her right to document judicial misconduct for oversight purposes. But more importantly, it contained the moral certainty that comes from knowing that truth requires no defense beyond its accurate presentation. The gallery filled quickly with legal professionals who understood they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the evolution of judicial accountability. Law professors from nearby universities sat beside veteran prosecutors and defense attorneys, their usual professional rivalries set aside in favor of witnessing how the system would respond to documented evidence of its own corruption. At precisely 9 o'clock, the bailiff called the court to order with the traditional ceremony that had opened federal proceedings for generations. But when Judge Victoria Stone emerged from her chambers, she bore little resemblance to the confident authority figure who had presided over yesterday's session. Her movements carried the stiffness of someone operating under extreme stress, her expression revealing the strain of a powerful individual suddenly confronted with the consequences of her own actions. Stone's opening statement confirmed Elena's prediction about the strategy that would be employed to discredit the recording. This court has been made aware of allegations regarding yesterday's proceedings, specifically claims that unauthorized recording equipment was used to document confidential judicial deliberations. We are here this morning to address these serious violations of court protocol and attorney ethics. Elena rose from her chair with the fluid grace of someone who had prepared for exactly this argument. Your Honor, with respect, there were no confidential deliberations recorded. The device captured only proceedings that took place in open court, in the presence of a jury, gallery, and court reporter. All recorded material is part of the public record. Stone's response revealed the desperation underlying her attempt to suppress evidence that had already been submitted to oversight authorities. Ms. Martinez, your unauthorized recording of court proceedings violates federal regulations and constitutes a breach of the trust that this court places in all attorneys who appear before it. The argument was legally weak and strategically flawed, but Stone's position left her with limited options for damage control. Elena's response demonstrated the thorough preparation that had characterized her approach to judicial accountability from the beginning. Your Honor, federal law explicitly permits attorneys to record proceedings for transcription and case preparation purposes. The recording in question was made using standard legal equipment in full view of court personnel. Moreover, the content of the recording consists entirely of statements made on the record in open court. Elena reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder containing legal precedents that supported her position. The Supreme Court has consistently held that public proceedings cannot be considered confidential, and that documentation of such proceedings serves legitimate oversight functions within the judicial system. Stone's attempt to challenge Elena's legal authority to make the recording was crumbling under the weight of established precedent, but her next argument revealed the personal animus that had driven yesterday's misconduct. Ms. Martinez, regardless of technical legalities, your actions demonstrate a fundamental lack of respect for judicial authority and an intention to undermine the dignity of these proceedings. Elena's response cut through Stone's rhetoric with surgical precision. Your Honor, if the recording undermines judicial dignity, it does so only by accurately documenting behavior that was undignified to begin with. The device captured exactly what occurred, nothing more and nothing less. The exchange was being recorded by court reporters and observed by judicial oversight representatives, creating a permanent record of Stone's attempt to suppress evidence of her own misconduct. Elena understood that every word of the hearing would be scrutinized by authorities who had already begun investigating the original complaints. Judge Harold Morrison, the Chief Judge of the Federal District, entered the courtroom at 10:15, with the bearing of someone who had been called in to manage a crisis that threatened the credibility of the entire judicial system. His presence confirmed that Elena's complaint had already triggered administrative procedures that Stone could not control through courtroom theatrics. Morrison's statement transformed the hearing from Stone's attempt at damage control into an official investigation of judicial misconduct. This court has received formal complaints regarding yesterday's proceedings, along with supporting evidence that requires immediate administrative review. Judge Stone will be temporarily recused from all cases pending completion of the investigation. The announcement sent a murmur through the gallery as the assembled legal professionals processed the implications of a federal judge being officially suspended based on recorded evidence of misconduct. Elena felt a surge of vindication, understanding that her months of planning had achieved exactly the outcome she had hoped for. Stone's attempt to protest Morrison's decision revealed the complete collapse of her judicial authority. Chief Judge Morrison, I object to these proceedings and request the opportunity to address these allegations through proper administrative channels. Morrison's response demonstrated the institutional commitment to accountability that Elena had hoped still existed within the federal judiciary. Judge Stone, the proper administrative channels are exactly what we are implementing. The recorded evidence will be evaluated by independent authorities, and appropriate disciplinary measures will be determined through established oversight procedures. Elena watched as Stone's career effectively ended in real time, destroyed, not by political enemies or personal vendettas, but by the documented evidence of her own ethical violations. The recording device that had seemed like such a simple tool had become the instrument of institutional change that Elena had envisioned when she first began documenting judicial misconduct. The hearing concluded with Morrison's announcement that all of Stone's recent cases would be reviewed for potential bias, a process that would likely result in numerous appeals and retrials. Elena's decision to risk everything for the sake of judicial accountability had triggered exactly the kind of systematic review that could prevent future abuses of power. As the courtroom emptied, Elena remained at the defense table, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Judge Victoria Stone's career was over, destroyed by her own documented words and actions. But more importantly, the precedent had been established that federal judges could be held accountable for ethical violations when sufficient evidence existed to prove misconduct. Marcus Thompson approached Elena's table as the gallery cleared, his expression carrying the relief of someone whose case had been vindicated by forces beyond his understanding. Ms. Martinez, what happens to my case now? Will I still face trial? Elena's response reflected the personal satisfaction that came from achieving justice for the innocent man who had become caught up in her larger battle against judicial corruption. Mr. Thompson, your case will be reassigned to a different judge and prosecuted according to proper legal standards. Given the documented bias in yesterday's proceedings, I'm confident that justice will finally be served. Thompson shook Elena's hand with the gratitude of someone whose life had been saved by an attorney's willingness to risk everything for the sake of principle. As he walked away, Elena understood that her personal mission had accomplished both: its immediate goal of protecting one innocent defendant and its broader purpose of establishing accountability within the judicial system. Chief Judge Morrison approached Elena's table as the last observers filed out of the courtroom, his expression carrying the complex mixture of appreciation and concern that characterized institutional leaders confronting evidence of systemic problems. Ms. Martinez, your actions yesterday have triggered a complete review of judicial conduct procedures. While I cannot comment on the specifics of Judge Stone's case, I want you to know that your evidence will be thoroughly investigated. Elena nodded respectfully, understanding that Morrison's statement represented both validation of her methods and warning about the institutional consequences that would follow. Chief Judge Morrison, I appreciate the court's commitment to accountability. My only concern has been ensuring that judicial authority serves justice rather than personal interests. Morrison's parting comment revealed the broader implications of Elena's documentation of judicial misconduct. Ms. Martinez, your recording has already prompted discussions about mandatory oversight procedures and enhanced transparency requirements. Change is never easy, but sometimes it becomes necessary. As Morrison departed, Elena found herself alone in the courtroom, where her legal career had effectively ended and her mission for judicial accountability had begun. The recording device in her briefcase no longer carried the weight of secret evidence, but served as a reminder of what could be accomplished when someone was willing to sacrifice personal security for institutional integrity. Elena's phone buzzed, with a call from David Morrison at her former law firm, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone managing relationships in the aftermath of a legal earthquake. Elena, I wanted to let you know that the firm has been contacted by several potential clients who specifically requested your representation. Your actions yesterday have created a reputation for integrity that some people find very appealing. The irony was not lost on Elena that her willingness to sacrifice her career for principle had actually enhanced her professional prospects, at least among clients who valued ethical courage over institutional connections. David, I appreciate you letting me know, but I'm not sure what my future practice will look like. Morrison's response suggested that Elena's transformation from institutional attorney to independent advocate had already been recognized by the legal community. Elena, there are people out there who need attorneys willing to challenge powerful interests when justice requires it. Your recording demonstrated a kind of courage that's rare in our profession. As Elena left the courthouse for what she understood might be the last time as a practicing attorney, she reflected on the strange mathematics of moral courage. She had lost her position at a prestigious law firm, destroyed her relationships with judicial colleagues, and risked professional sanctions that could have ended her career permanently. But she had also established a precedent for judicial accountability that would protect countless future defendants from the kind of bias and corruption that had characterized Stone's courtroom. The afternoon sun broke through the gray clouds as Elena descended the courthouse steps, creating patterns of light and shadow on the granite surface that seemed to mirror the complex legacy of her confrontation with judicial authority. Behind her, the wheels of institutional change were already beginning to turn, driven by recorded evidence that could not be denied, explained away, or buried in administrative procedures. Elena's apartment that evening felt different than it had 24 hours earlier. The recording device sat on her kitchen table not as a weapon of institutional warfare, but as a reminder of what could be accomplished when someone possessed both the evidence to prove corruption and the courage to act on that evidence, regardless of personal consequences. Her phone rang at 7 o'clock with a call from Sarah Chen, a reporter for the Legal Tribune who had been covering federal court proceedings for nearly 2 decades. Ms. Martinez, I've been following the Stone case, and I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to discuss the broader implications of what you've accomplished. Elena's response reflected her understanding that the story was bigger than one corrupt judge or one courageous attorney. Sarah, what I've accomplished is demonstrating that judicial accountability is possible when sufficient evidence exists, and someone is willing to act on it. The implications for systemic reform are something the legal community will have to determine. Chen's follow-up question addressed the personal cost of Elena's principled stand against institutional corruption. Ms. Martinez, you've essentially sacrificed your career to expose one judge's misconduct. Do you have any regrets about the price you've paid for this victory? Elena's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had weighed all costs and benefits before acting. Sarah, I haven't sacrificed my career. I've redefined it. There are people in this community who need attorneys willing to challenge powerful interests when justice requires it, and that's exactly the kind of practice I intend to build. The interview concluded with Chen's observation that Elena's recording had already prompted legislative discussions about enhanced oversight procedures and mandatory transparency requirements for federal judges. The institutional changes that Elena had hoped to trigger were already beginning to take shape, driven by the documented evidence of corruption that could no longer be ignored or suppressed. Elena spent the evening reviewing emails from potential clients, fellow attorneys, and legal scholars who had been following the Stone case. The messages revealed a legal community grappling with the implications of documented judicial misconduct and the precedent Elena had established for holding powerful officials accountable for ethical violations. One email particularly stood out, sent by Professor Margaret Williams from the University Law School. Williams had spent her career studying judicial ethics and institutional accountability, and her message offered perspective on the broader significance of Elena's actions. Ms. Martinez, your recording has accomplished something that legal scholars have been advocating for decades. Proof that systematic documentation of judicial misconduct can trigger meaningful institutional change. The Stone case will be studied for years as an example of how individual courage can reshape institutional behavior. As midnight approached, Elena reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from respected associate at a prestigious law firm to unemployed attorney with a national reputation for challenging judicial authority. The transformation had cost her financial security and professional relationships, but it had also provided something more valuable: the certainty that comes from knowing you have acted according to principle, regardless of consequences. Elena's laptop displayed the website for the independent legal aid clinic she was planning to establish, an organization dedicated to representing clients who needed attorneys willing to challenge powerful interests when justice required it. The clinic would be funded through donations and grants from organizations committed to judicial accountability, and it would serve as a model for legal practice based on principle rather than profit. The recording device still sat on Elena's kitchen table, its black plastic surface reflecting the overhead light like a mirror of the institutional change it had triggered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to defend justice against corruption. But tonight, Elena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at having proved that individual courage could still reshape institutional behavior when, armed with irrefutable evidence of wrongdoing, Judge Victoria Stone's career was over, destroyed by her own documented words and actions. But Elena Martinez's mission was just beginning, supported by a legal community that had rediscovered the possibility of holding powerful officials accountable for ethical violations. The recording had captured more than judicial misconduct. It had documented the moment when one person's refusal to accept corruption triggered the institutional changes necessary to prevent future abuses of power. Elena turned off her laptop and prepared for sleep, understanding that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter in her legal career and in the broader struggle for judicial accountability. The battle against institutional corruption was far from over, but the precedent had been established that truth, properly documented and courageously presented, could still triumph over power that had grown too comfortable with its own impunity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.